The Leduc #1 Energy Discovery Center. Alberta can afford to be on top of the world because of what's underneath. It's sitting on 170 billion barrels of oil, the third largest deposit on the globe. Everyone wants it, but getting it, well, that's what brings us here. Alberta is oil. 1 in every 14 jobs here is in the energy sector. In the last year, the province raked in nearly $4 billion in royalties. And over the next 25 years, the oil sands will create more than $440 billion in Canadian tax revenue. There's enough oil to meet the country's current demand for almost 400 years. So there are several major new pipelines in the works. They would amp up the export capacity to both the United States and Asia. But the plans are controversial. Are we asking for big bucks or big trouble? Moving oil west has Alberta in a high-profile dispute with British Columbia. That province argues it has a serious stake in this too, economic and environmental. Last night on the National, BC Premier Christy Clark shared her thoughts about getting past the disagreement.
The ball is very much in Alberta's court. Alberta is going to get the bulk of the benefit from this project.
So what does Alberta say? Today, Premier Alison Redford took time to chat with us in Edmonton, even as the fall session of the provincial legislature began. We spoke in the Legislative Library. Part of the discussion that's taken place, certainly in the last couple of weeks, is the relationship between you and your neighbour in British Columbia and the discussions that the two of you, the two premiers, have had. Now, if we go to the last one, from what I understand, you both described it as frosty and difficult. Just how bad was it in that room for 15 minutes?
Well, it wasn't really a difficult discussion because our perspective is that we very clearly understand in Alberta what the Premier of British Columbia has asked for. I wanted to meet with her because she was coming to Calgary, and I had thought that she wanted to sort of open the discussion up a little bit more. As it turned out, that wasn't the case. British Columbia has basically said that there are 5 points or issues that they're concerned with. What I've said to Premier Clark is we absolutely support what British Columbia is saying with respect to the first 4 points, which are all about environmental impact and that sort of thing, Aboriginal consultation.
Everybody is. Everybody in the room, including the feds, are in agreement on those.
Absolutely, because those are Canadian values, and we all have those values in our jurisdictions.
So it comes down to money.
The 5th point really is that, and what does economic benefit look like? And from our perspective, we're prepared to have that conversation too. But what we're not prepared to do is to say that economic benefit should be equated to Alberta transferring our royalty revenue to another jurisdiction. And
she seems to have now taken that off the table.
Well, day to day, I hope that that's the case. It certainly hasn't been talked about in the last 2 weeks, and I think that's helpful because it allows us to take the conversation somewhere else. I hope the conversation can go somewhere else. Because
did she actually say to you in the meeting that she wanted a chunk of the royalties?
It has been a continuing theme. And so very clearly, and we're not going to keep belaboring the point, we've simply said that we're not prepared to talk about that. Because if we do that, I do think we're fundamentally altering Confederation. You know, we talk about pipeline across the country. We have a pipeline in Alberta called the Alliance Pipeline, which has been around for over 30 years. Well, what is the purpose of the Alliance Pipeline? It's to pipe BC product to the United States. At no point when that pipeline was ever being built did Alberta say to British Columbia, well, you know what, we'd really like a share of that revenue. Because that's not how Confederation works. You know, we ship potash across our borders. We're looking always to alleviate trade boundaries between our provinces. And so it's important for us to not alter that.
Can you equate the Alliance Pipeline with the concerns that BC has over potential dangers to the waters off the West Coast from a spill? Can you equate those two things?
Well, we certainly, I wouldn't equate them. I don't think it's about the risk. I think it's about the infrastructure and the principle of how we decide how to build infrastructure and what that means for different jurisdictions. Every single project that goes into any ecological system is going to have some sort of impact, and it's important for us to accept that. You know, that is not a British Columbia coast. It's a Canadian coast. Premier Clark has certainly said that when she's been here in Edmonton, particularly last year. And the converse side of that is that a Canadian coast is a coast that should be available for all Canadians to be able to make use of to export their product.
If royalties are off the table, and it seems to me what you're saying to me, that hasn't been stated clearly to you yet?
Well, all I would say is it doesn't really matter to me whether or not the government of British Columbia thinks they're off the table. It's not something that Alberta is going to talk about. So from that perspective, they're off the table.
All right. Well, there are other ways to achieve economic benefits other than going after your royalties. Yeah. Do you appreciate BC's argument that 8%, which I think is kind of the accepted figure of the way things would stand right now, is not enough for the risk that BC could be taking?
Well, I would never think that it's going to be constructive for us to equate risk to economic benefit, but I would certainly agree that any premier in this country is going to want to make sure that if there are infrastructure and commercial projects in their jurisdiction, that they are getting and maximizing the economic benefit to their province for that initiative. But, you know, for example, one of the things that we find in Alberta is that municipal governments are able to collect a great deal of revenue from something we call linear assessment, which is simply the pipeline that's moving through the municipality and the taxation to the company that's operating the pipeline. One of the things we've observed is that we don't think that any of the assessment that's been done with respect to economic benefit in British Columbia has fully, and in some cases at all, taken into account what the income would be as a result of linear assessment.
The Premier of BC's suggested that you and the Prime Minister and she sit down.
Well, I have.
No, but she's, made that suggestion once again. Do you think that would be reasonable to have that discussion?
Well,
the three of you?
I think I've certainly taken the approach that any time the Premier of British Columbia wants to sit down to try to move through some of these issues, that we're there to be helpful to try to do that. If the conversation takes a different direction, then I think it might be possible. From our perspective, at this point, there doesn't seem to be that much to discuss. And I do believe that at the end of the day, I don't actually believe that it is the role of the government of Alberta to facilitate discussion on economic benefit within the boundaries of British Columbia. I think that's the responsibility of the government of British Columbia, working with people that are proponents of a commercial project.
In other words, industry.
I think so.
Let's talk about another element of the business relationship, and that's the takeover issue, which is a lot of people sitting on the sidelines right now trying to figure out exactly what's going on. Were you surprised last Friday night when the Progress Energy deal was rejected by the federal cabinet?
I was perhaps a little surprised by the timing. I think everyone was quite surprised by the timing, just being
the midnight
so
Eastern time, 10 o'clock, relatively early in the day for you.
Yeah. I think that there's no doubt that we know that Industry Canada is looking very carefully at a number of these transactions right now, and we've been very clear that we are very welcoming of foreign investment, whether that is foreign investment from state-owned enterprises or other entities that aren't state-owned enterprises. And we have an awful lot of companies that have invested in Alberta in the energy sector, and in fact, it's been critical to the development of our energy sector. But I really
just to clarify, it doesn't make any difference to you whether they're state-owned or not state-owned.
Well, I'm just going to just go a bit further on that, because I do think that what Industry Canada is doing right now and what the Prime Minister is doing in terms of trying to sort out exactly what that relationship should be that could still allow for foreign investment in the context of a state-owned enterprise as opposed to perhaps a private sector entity is important. And I'm pleased to see that there's still dialogue going on. But I do understand what Industry Canada is trying to do, and I think they've taken some good steps, and I'm pleased to see that there seems to be an effort to try to find some progress. What that ends up being, we shall see.
Does it worry you, though, what that deal, the rejection of that deal, at least so far, could mean for the much bigger deal involving Nexon?
Well, I see it as all in context, which is what's going on right now is a discussion within the Government of Canada, and I think probably partly publicly as well. for us as Canadians and for the Government of Canada to determine if we do move forward with arrangements like this, what that means for Canada and how we want them to proceed. So I don't really see either of them in isolation, but I wouldn't take from the Friday night decision any particular signal that we should presume that the outcome of anything else is finalized.
What is what worries you about these two potential sales if they don't go through?
Well,
what's the signal?
I think it's important for us as citizens of a global economy to be thinking about how we want to connect. And there's no doubt, certainly from an Alberta perspective, that China is a critical market for us. What I want to make sure that we're not signaling is that we're not open for business, because the reciprocal side of that is that places where we want to market products, not just oil and gas, but protein and agriculture and technology and education opportunities, we need access to those markets. And we want to make sure that that's a strong relationship. And the relationship between Canada and China has really been growing at a tremendous rate. And it's important for us to acknowledge that and make sure that we're honoring that.
Well, one of the other things that's grown at a tremendous rate between the two countries is China's ownership of a significant chunk of the oil sands. Depending on who you read, it's somewhere in the 20 to even maybe as high as 25%. Mm-hmm. That seems to concern a lot of Canadians, and that's why a lot of Canadians seem concerned about the Nexen deal.
Well, there's a subtlety here that I remind people of very often. Our resources belong to Albertans and Canadians. What we do is we basically provide leases to companies to allow them to explore and to extract resources. When they do that, they pay us for those leases, and we collect revenue, which is then part of the Canadian economy. So we are not ever in a position where we are selling our resources outright. We're simply making decisions about how they can best be extracted and how that can best support the Canadian economy. So,
but they also then have control of where that product ends up, though, right?
Well, fortunately, where that product ends up is where we would like to market that product to. If you talk to companies
now, but not necessarily always.
Well, okay, but I think that's a bit of a hypothetical if we look at where the economic growth is happening in the world right now. This summer there was much discussion about how China was, quote, slowing down to 7.5% growth. Well, we're not seeing 7.5% growth in very many other places. And so I think that we need to be realistic about the fact that there are benefits to both sides in these deals, and that's very often and should be the case in commercial transactions.